We live in a beautiful world, a world that is diverse, a world that has been shaped by time, that creates these incredible landscapes for us to enjoy and for us to capture. But this is a world that is also changing rapidly as well. And as photographers, it is one of our duties to record all of these changes that are happening, to preserve these memories of these things that are around us. Landscape photography is a great way to get familiar with your camera, familiar with your settings, but also to really enjoy your photography and also find a little bit of peace of mind as well. There truly is a sense of exploration when you get out there on your own with your camera, ready to record the world around you. I wanted to help you to take better landscape photos. On into our lesson number 5. Landscape photography. It is a lot more than just about landscape photography. However, we are going to be introducing an important concept when it comes to exposure. We're going to be having a look at how to control exposure a little bit more, and we're going to talk a little bit about stops of light as well. We'll also in the next lesson introduce our different metering modes as well, and how you can combine them with what you learn in this lesson to really up your game when it comes to capturing accurate exposures. So with that in mind, let's dig into topic number 1, which is capturing correct exposures. So just a couple of common terms to go over for this lesson. First of all, we're going to talk all about exposure, the light meter, exposure compensation, dynamic range. Then a little bit later, we'll have a look at HDR, neutral density filters, and many more. But just to refresh your memory on the exposure triangle, hopefully it is burned into your brains now at this stage. The exposure triangle is controlled by light, which is the aperture, by time, which is the shutter speed, and by ISO, which is the sensitivity, which we're going to be having a look at in detail in lesson number 7. The balance between the 3 of these elements will give us our exposure, will give us our photograph. Now, as we're well aware, we can't do so much when it comes to controlling the light via the aperture, but we can certainly do plenty by controlling the shutter speed and by controlling the sensitivity. So how do we know when we need to adjust an exposure? Well, first of all, we can take a photograph and we can review it afterwards, and we're going to be able to see whether the exposure is going to be different. Like, for example, in this instance, we can clearly see that this is an overexposed photograph. Have you ever seen a photograph? Have you ever taken a photograph that looks like this? This is when the highlights are all blown out. So this is when I'm talking about the bright parts of the photograph, like the snow, like the clouds here in this image. There's no details in the whites. Now, what I mean by no details is that they're completely gone. They're not recoverable, so don't think that you could put this into post-editing, post-production and get those details back. It's not possible. They're simply gone altogether. They cannot be recovered in post-editing. So while we can use post-editing to somewhat save or to enhance exposures, is really what we should be doing with post-editing, is to make our good photographs better. We shouldn't really be using it as a tool to fix a photograph, but there are times when it may be necessary. However, a completely overexposed photographs, it isn't possible to recover detail. Underexposed is the opposite. It is when we don't have enough light in the photograph. When there's not enough light, the shadows are flat and dark. There's details lost in the black parts of the photograph. We can try to recover these, but what will happen is that lots of noise will be revealed post-editing. So noise is that static effect that we get in our photographs when the image is too dark or when we use a very high ISO. So while we can recover details here, we're going to introduce a lot of noise. Noise is very present in the shadow parts of our photograph, so we generally don't want to brighten those shadows. A correct exposure is when we have the right amount of light in the scene. That means we have lots of details in the whites, we have lots of details in the blacks, we have room to edit the exposure creatively. So we can then, introduce a bit of post-production here and have fun with this to enhance our image, not to correct it, and we can get creative with our post-editing. And importantly, we have a wide range of tones. That means we can see lots of detail in all areas of the photograph, from the darkest blacks to the whitest whites, everything else in between. We've got a lot of tone. That means we've got a good wide dynamic range. Dynamic range we'll speak about a little bit more later on in this lesson. So our phones are very, very intelligent and user friendly. So when we're capturing a photograph using our Pro mode, We can generally see if the image is going to be over or underexposed before we take the photograph simply by looking at the LCD screen. And you can try this out if you're in pro mode, adjust that shutter speed and you will see the image get brighter and you'll see the image get darker depending on what way you go with the shutter speed. But there is a way that we can measure the exposure even before taking the photograph without having to look or rely on the camera's LCD screen, and that is through the camera's light meter. So in pro mode, you're going to see this little kind of dial here. It may look slightly different depending on the type of phone that you're using, but generally it's going to be some variation of this where we have essentially a scale, a plus and minus scale with numbers going on each side of it. Now, those minus numbers indicate an underexposure. It means our image is going to be underexposed. The plus side means it'll be overexposed. So we can actually use this, if we want to reduce the amount of light or add more light, or we're trying to get the correct exposure. So light is measured in what we call stops of light. Anytime we add or reduce the amount of light in a photograph, we're changing it by a variation of stops. A stop is either doubling or halving the amount of light in a scene. So say, for example, I wanted to add 1 stop. That means I'm going to double the amount of light in the scene. If I reduce the exposure by 1 stop, I'm halving the amount of light in the scene. A correct exposure, if we're aiming for a correct exposure, that is when we have the indicator, the little rectangle here underneath the numbers, that when that is in the middle, like it is displayed here, that indicates that we have the correct exposure. So the light meter is like a balancing scale. We want to try and get that little indicator in the middle to get the correct exposure. But of course, we can use this in our own way. If we purposely want to add light, we can dial it up to the plus side. If we want to reduce the amount of light, we can go to the minus side. Let's make this visual to understand it even more. So here we have a scene. We can see the light meter here. I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can see it here highlighted there in yellow. We can see we've got our plus and minus. So everything over on the left side is minus, everything over on the right side is our plus. And here we can see that we have the correct exposure because the indicator is in the middle. And of course, if we look at the photograph, we can see here we've lots and lots of detail, probably losing a little bit of detail in those very bright parts there way in the distance. But overall, this is a great exposure. So light meter is at 0. That means that the exposure is correct. We take the photograph and we have the correct exposure. Light meter is in the middle, exposure is correct. Now, let's see what happens if we were to add 1 stop. So I want you to start using that term. Remember, a stop is either doubling or halving the amount of light in a scene. So if I increase the exposure here by 1 stop, you can see now the image is brighter. We're beginning to really lose those details in the background. But overall, it's not terrible. It's still a somewhat usable exposure. So I'm just exaggerating the effect here, but generally you will see the little white indicator move to the +1 side, and that means that we've got double the amount of light than is needed for the correct exposure. So if my light meter is at +1, that means 2 times the amount of light is coming in than is needed to get the correct exposure. Now, as we can see, this is somewhat subjective. You may prefer this exposure, but technically it isn't correct. Let's see what happens if we add another stop of light to this scene. So if I was to increase the light again, now we can see that things are really beginning to get overexposed. Okay, so it's getting far too bright in the background. We're definitely losing all those details. The colours are beginning to get washed out, and it just looks completely overexposed. Now, the reason that it's so much more extreme is that because we've doubled the light again, it is now 4 times the amount of light that is needed. Every time you increase by a stop, you are doubling the amount of light. So if I increase by 1 stop, that means I double the amount of light. If I increase it by 2 stops, that means there's now 4 times the amount of light than is needed for the correct exposure. If I went to +3, that means there's going to be 8 times the amount of light than is needed for the correct exposure because it doubles each time. Now, I'm sure you're getting the idea here, but let's just have a look at if we go the other way. So if I underexpose the image here, now we can see that we've gone one stop darker here. That means half the amount of light is now getting to the scene than is needed for the correct exposure. And again, it's somewhat subjective. You may prefer this exposure. We've still got plenty of detail there. It's getting a little bit dark, but it does add a little bit more atmosphere to the image. So this is where things can get a little bit subjective when you are working with exposure. If I go again, we can see it's much darker. We're beginning to lose details. Most importantly, it's beginning to get a little bit flat. So typically when an image is underexposed, we lose contrast. That is the kind of difference between the dark and the lighter tones that gives the image a bit of punch. This is getting a little bit flat. So we are now 4 times less the amount of light than is needed to get the correct exposure. Because remember, it doubles again. So we're 4 times less, -2, 4 times less the amount of light than is needed. So we can control exposure using the light meter, and as we've seen using Pro mode, we can adjust our shutter speed, we can adjust our ISO to make sure that we get the light meter in the middle. But there is another way, a somewhat, I suppose, more convenient way to adjust exposure, and that's using exposure compensation. So exposure compensation, you may have seen this symbol on your cameras before, and again, this is available when you are using Pro mode. So for using semi-auto modes or an auto Pro mode, exposure compensation is a quick way to adjust exposure. In fully Pro mode, it is not used. So if you have a look at your Pro mode, you may find that you have this auto and manual option. Auto basically means that your Pro mode is going to decide the exposure, but you can actually use exposure compensation to purposely over or underexpose the scene as you want. In manual fully Pro mode, you make all the adjustments yourself. So if you want to control the shutter speed, you want to control the ISO and everything else, you're going to do that using fully Pro manual mode. A little bit confusing, I'm sure, but it'll make sense the more that you use it. Let's just have a quick look at how exposure compensation, or how to use exposure compensation. It's very simple. So simply, when we're photographing, one of the options we have is that when we touch on the subject that we want to expose for and we hold, you can see that it comes up with this little indicator, little brightness indicator. That's our exposure compensation. So when we touch on our object, we can simply slide our finger up and down, and we can adjust it. So you can increase or decrease based on what the light meter is telling you. The camera will adjust the other settings automatically. So you don't need to worry about if you're increasing the exposure, do you need to change your shutter speed or your ISO? The camera is actually going to do that for you. All you're doing is deciding whether or not you want to make the image brighter or darker. That's all we do when we're using exposure compensation. The camera controls everything else. Now, obviously, then the caveat to that is that we cannot pick a specific shutter speed or specific ISO if we wanted to use that. For that instance, we would need to go into the fully manual mode within the Pro mode. So another way to do that is using exposure compensation in Pro. You can select the Auto Pro mode option, as I mentioned, and use exposure for quick adjustments. And this is typically what I would do. I would go into the Pro mode, but I would set it to the Auto Pro mode. So it will work out the exposure for me, and I'll adjust the exposure simply by going plus or minus using the exposure compensation to get the correct exposure. But I do lose control over the shutter and ISO settings specifically, because the camera will decide those for me to get the correct exposure. So if I wanted to do, say, an action shot where I needed a really high shutter speed, I would need to go into the fully manual mode on my phone. So I hope that's clear. But typically, when I'm shooting day to day, this is how I would use it. I would simply go into the auto mode in my Pro mode and just adjust the exposure compensation if I needed to. Okay, so let's have a look at now an example of that. Here we come back to our overexposed image that we saw a little bit earlier. I have a look at my light meter. It's indicating to me that it's +1. So there's, remember, too much light getting into the image. There's double the amount of light then is needed for the scene. So using my exposure compensation, I can dial it back to the middle and get the correct exposure. Okay, so you should be able to see the difference there between the two exposures, and sometimes it's not until you actually see the difference in exposure that you can actually see which one is the correct one. At first glance, the image on the left probably looks correct, but when we adjust the exposure, we can actually see that we were beginning to lose details in the sky. Now again, it is somewhat subjective, but realistically, the one over on the right side is what we would consider the correct exposure. Let's have a look at another example. So here we have an image that is completely underexposed. We saw it earlier on again. In this instance, it is 2 stops underexposed. That means there's 4 times less light than is needed to get the correct exposure. So using my adjustments, my exposure compensation, I can dial it back to the middle and I can get the correct exposure. Okay, so that's just some of the basics when it comes to exposure. And as I mentioned, I find exposure compensation to be a great option when using a smartphone for quick adjustments. And, you know, if you're still struggling a little bit with that fully pro manual mode, it is recommended that you go into the pro mode and switch it to auto or whatever it happens to be called on your phone. And you can just start using exposure compensation then instead as is needed. It's a great stepping stone into fully learning how to use your camera. Now in the next lesson, as I mentioned, we're going to combine this then with our different metering modes so we can make sure that we get the correct exposure every single time, no matter what the scenario is. Now, so let's just park that for the moment, and here's a question for you, or did you know, whatever you like to call it. What city is this? Is it Dublin? Is it Paris? Is it Boston? Or is it London? Guess what? Answer will be revealed at the end of the lesson. Now again, this is a photograph of some significance, so I want you to tell me, what city do you think it is? Is it Dublin, Paris, Boston or London? Just simply type in your answer. You know where to type it in. Simply type it into more quickly just to show you again. Is it Dublin, my hometown? Is it Paris? Is it Boston? Or is it London? Okay, and again, no looking it up, although it'd probably be difficult to look it up. But again, a photograph of some historical significance in the history of photography anyway. So we will reveal the answer. Moving on then into our next topic. Topic 2, we're going to talk all about dynamic range, high dynamic range, and neutral density filters, which are a whole lot of fun. Now, we mentioned HDR back all the way in lesson number 1, high dynamic range, but to really understand what it is and how to use it properly, we need to understand what dynamic range is. And dynamic range basically is the difference between the darkest and the lightest tones in our photographs. And it's not always possible to capture them in one exposure, and this is particularly troublesome when we are photographing landscapes. It typically happens when we've got bright skies and backlit subjects. So if we have a look at this example here, we can see that I've basically broken it down into 4 sections. I have a correctly exposed sky in my left hand image, but my foreground is underexposed. So I adjust my exposure to try to get the correct exposure in the foreground in the other side, but then I get an overexposed sky. And simply the difference between the two areas, the overexposure and the underexposure, is too great that I cannot get the correct exposure with my light meter set to 0. So if I underexpose the image to try to bring back the sky, I lose my foreground. If I overexpose it to bring back the foreground, I lose the sky. And I simply cannot get both extremes in one image. That difference is known as dynamic range, and it's our camera's ability to be able to see all the brightest parts of an image in any one time compared to the ability to see all the darkest parts of an image at any one time. Now, our eyes are able to see all of these differences. So if we were to look at the scene, we can see all the details in the bright parts and the dark parts at once. Our cameras cannot, and this is often where frustration really sets in, where we're like, why can't I capture that the way that I see it? And it's typically down to dynamic range. Okay, so this is where we can introduce HDR, high dynamic range. And we had a look at this briefly back in lesson 1. So high dynamic range, just to review, is when the camera takes multiple exposures and it combines them together to create one exposure. Like you can see in the image here, it's a good example, as I mentioned before, where we can actually see that this image was taken with a camera, and the camera hasn't been able to capture all the details there in the background, okay, in terms of the exposure. But if we have a look at the phone is actually, on a HDR, and we can see then that it is capturing those details. It's getting the sky and it's getting all of the details there as well. That is because it is a high dynamic range image. It is great for landscapes and backlit photographs. Okay. Now, we do need to keep it steady in this mode because it's combining exposures together. Now, it does it very rapidly, but for best results, it should be kept very, very steady. Let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So, high dynamic range photography can range from a minimum of 2 photographs to anywhere up to 7+ photographs combined together to get the correct exposure. Typically, it's going to be in and around 2 or 3. Now, it is also possible to do manual HDR photography where we do different exposures ourselves and we can combine them later on using post-editing. But in camera HDR, it'll typically take 2 photographs. So one's going to be an overexposed. So whilst it's not too overly exposed, we have lost some details here in the sky, as we can see here in the background. Compared to an underexposed image here, you can just see how much more detail is brought back in the sky and in the sea as well. But of course, then we're beginning to lose details all around the edges of the photograph in particular. You can see it gets very, very dark. So by taking 2 of the photographs and combining them together to create the one final exposure, we have one that covers the full dynamic range. So that's what high dynamic range is. It captures those 2 extremes, that extreme in the brightness and that extreme in the darkness, and it combines them together to give us one exposure that looks truer to what we see, true to our vision. Now, a lot of people will also edit their HDR photographs, and sometimes they over edit them, and that's where you get this kind of almost surreal, false looking type of photograph. That's something that we can do creatively with our HDR photography that we'll have a look at a later stage. But really, HDR photography is designed to overcome exposure issues. So it's not just a look, a certain style to the photograph. It is designed to overcome exposure issues and is particularly useful when it comes to landscape photography. Now, if you're intent on capturing your own manual exposures using your phone and capturing landscape photography, you will definitely want to invest in some ND filters, neutral density filters. Neutral density filters will darken the image, allowing us to get longer exposure times in bright situations, like here, to get that type of misty flowing water effect. So it's a dark glass used to lengthen exposure time. It is difficult to do long exposures in daylight hours. Now, after our shutter speed lesson, our last lesson, you may have been out there practicing your shutter speeds and found that your images were becoming very overexposed when you were using longer shutter speeds in daylight hours. And that's because there's simply too much light, far too much light coming into the sensor, and it becomes completely overexposed. So neutral density filter is designed to reduce that light. They're measured in different densities, different darknesses. They're great to create that misty water effect and do long exposures. You definitely need some sort of tripod though, however, when you are using them, to avoid camera shake. Let's look at them. So neutral density filters increase in density. Each increase is one stop. So as we saw earlier, a stop is doubling or halving the amount of light. In this instance, we are reducing the light 4 times the amount of light coming into the image. So we bring in our neutral density filter, and now you can see the difference has been made already. And in this case, we use an ND4 filter because that reduces the exposure time, or that reduces the exposure, the stops, by 4 times. So it reduces that light as much as we need. As you can see here, we still have the same settings, but now that we've introduced that filter, our image is correct. So neutral density filters, I recommend that you go with the variable ND filter. That is one filter that you can simply rotate to darken and increase the density as is needed. You can get ones that will stack as well if you prefer, but I find the variable ones just a little bit more compact, a little bit more convenient as you just rotate them to make the image darker. And again, you can pick these up online. You'll find them pretty much straight away when you Google them. They again come in lots of different qualities, but if you want to try them out, you can try them out for as little as about €15 or $15. Now, so let's just have a quick look at what is coming up in our next lesson before we move on to our final topic. We're going to have a look at portrait photography, and that does include selfies, as you can see here. We're going to have a look at portrait so you can get better portrait photographs, composition for portrait photography. We'll have a look at those different metering modes that we can use as well to better our exposure, and particularly to help us overcome tricky portrait exposures too. We'll have a look at bokeh as well, which I know a lot of you have been asking about too, how to achieve that with your portrait. So lots to cover in our portrait photography lesson. Now our topic then for this lesson is to just give you some general tips of where and when you should be photographing, what to look out for with your landscape photography. And successful landscape photography is all about preparation. Now, obviously, you know, there's going to be times where we're just out there, we're on holidays, and we just want to capture a nice landscape of where we are. But, you know, when you're going on holidays, you're going to do research about where you're going. So think about doing a little bit more research about where you should go and photograph as well. Think about how you're going to get there, what you're going to need, how long it's going to take, all of that to get a good landscape photograph. There is a little bit of work involved in putting yourself out there in the right place at the right time to get that photograph that stands out from everyone else's. So with landscape photography, the first thing to do is all about location. It's all about where you go and what you decide to capture. Obviously, do your research about what type of landscape photography you want to do and what's available to you. Start locally to practice. So, you know, if that means just going to your local park, or, you know, if you're lucky enough to live close to a beach or beside the sea, think about go there and just do a short trip and just start somewhere local to practice. And start with simple compositions. Remember our basic compositions that we had a look at in lesson number 3, things like our rule of thirds. Really, really good when it comes to landscape photography. And bring a tripod with you. You should really invest in a tripod if you hadn't guessed that already at this stage. But certainly when it comes to landscape photography, it's pretty much essential, especially if you decide you want to do those longer exposures using a neutral density filter. And use lower ISOs. So if you are photographing in your pro manual mode, you can set the ISO very low. So the lower number, the better. Now again, don't worry too much if you don't understand about ISOs at this stage. We haven't really covered them in great detail, but just use the lower number. No need to go with high ISOs. It'll keep the image nice and clean and free from noise. And cloudy days can still be used for practice. So don't worry if the weather is not particularly good, particularly nice on the day that you're photographing. You can still absolutely get a great shot with a cloudy day as well. And you can just get familiar with your camera and find a spot that you want to photograph and revisit at a later stage. Getting up early is a great way to get photographs that are full of colour and we'll speak about the golden hour and the blue hour in just a moment. If you're embarking on a full day shoot, so if you're deciding that you're going to take a bit of a day trip somewhere, make sure that you bring everything that you need, like, you know, some food, some water, you know, make sure that you know where you're going as well. Just do your preparation beforehand. Make sure you're dressed appropriately as well. Don't just photograph from your eye level. Think about getting lower. Think about putting something in the foreground. Think about what's going on in the background as well. Like this composition here, you know, we've got that balance that we spoke about before, where we've got the nice rocks in the foreground. They're quite dark, but they're balanced off nicely by that sunset or that sunrise in the background. Be aware of your foreground, as I just mentioned. Use it to add depth and perspective to the scene as well. Now, when you're photographing, revisit an area frequently, especially if it's somewhere local to you. You can always go back and revisit it at different times, different days, different weather, different seasons as well, to get that different light, to get that impact of time on that area as well, how it changes over the course of time too. And travel to places that you may not have considered before, like this photograph here, the desert, somewhere I would love to go visit the desert. Morocco is a great place if you're thinking about going to visit the desert, because you've got access to it there as well. But, think outside the box. Landscape photography doesn't always just have to be, lots of greenery, lots of mountains. It can be something quite different as well. And not all landscapes have to be pretty and beautiful. You can photograph industrial areas. You can photograph the wants to photograph as well. You can make your holiday about that. You can make going away just about visiting somewhere specifically with the intention of getting some great photographs. If you're photographing in the city at night, if you want to do some nighttime landscapes, it really is advised to have a friend with you for safety. There's safety in numbers. Think about investing in filters. We spoke about ND filters earlier on. UV filters, polarizing filters, we will speak about at a later stage. But to think about investing in a filter kit, you can get these filter kits where you get them all in one, and these will all have different effects on your photography. And shooting RAW and JPEG if it's an option available to you. We're going to speak about RAW in our editing lessons, in later lessons. If it's an option that you can shoot in both file types, I recommend that you do it, because you can use your RAW files when you get more advanced, and JPEG ones are great just for quick sharing and quick editing as well. But again, we'll speak about both those file types in an upcoming lesson. Now, I mentioned golden hour a little bit earlier on, and golden hour is at 2 times of the day. It happens twice in a day, provided the weather is good. Is 1 hour after dawn, so just after the sun has come up, and 1 hour before sunset, just before the sun goes down. And these are considered the optimal times to get these wonderful type of golden photographs, as it suggests, the golden hour. Just be aware, obviously, then, before dawn and before sunset, or after dawn and before sunset, the light direction is going to change. So, if you're after a particular angle for your light, again, think about, that golden hour, where the light's going to be coming from, depending on what part of the world you are in. It's going to change. It's going to rise in one location and set in another location, and that will change the direction of light. Okay, so do think about that when you're photographing. Obviously, that little bit easier to get out there just before the sun goes down, and get it at that time. But make the effort and get up, before dawn, and you're going to also get very quiet photographs. There won't be as many people around. There won't be as much interference happening just before or 1 hour after dawn. I would recommend, though, getting up that little bit extra early, because you also have blue hour. So blue hour is before dawn breaks, so just before the sun breaks over the horizon and creates golden hour. We've also got blue hour. It's also just after the sun sets as well. So, take that extra little bit of time either side of the sun coming up and going down, and you'll get blue hour. But you will need a tripod, because the light's going to be much darker at that stage. You're going to still be just on the cusp of day breaking, or the cusp of night happening, twilight happening. So bring a tripod with you. But there you go. So within the space of 2 hours, realistically, you've got blue hour and you've got golden hour to get some terrific shots. Now, so with all of this then, you can combine all of these tips and these approaches with our compositional techniques that we spoke about in lesson number 3. But just a couple of extra compositions, other things to have a look out for when it comes to photographing landscapes, just to make them that little bit more interesting, is to have a look out for some basic things like shapes. So landscape photography, although this would be kind of considered an interior as well, it would still kind of fall within that landscape category. You can see here we've kind of got those leading lines but in a circular motion, so look out for shapes in your landscapes. Here's another example where we've got a lot of geometric shapes, we've got lots of triangular shapes kind of offset then with that kind of snaking line there as well. So what nice wide angle here used. Again, think about that perspective, the angle that you're shooting at, to find those shapes as well in the landscape, especially when it comes to photographing in cities and in forests. Think about patterns that are around you and repetition. So here we've got Dutch landscape, we've got those lovely colors here as well, those leading lines. Good example of the rule of thirds here too. Our eyes are being drawn to that windmill here in the distance. We've also got those shapes going on as well, so there's kind of a lot going on here within this landscape. And think about all of that when you are composing your landscapes. Start off simple, start off with shapes, start off with rule of thirds, and you will see a rapid advancement in the quality of your landscape photography. Mentioned repetition. So repetition is when something repeats, a little bit different from a pattern, but like these cinema seats or these theater seats here, we've got a repetition going on here leading us through the photograph. Repetition can also be something that you can find on the street here, again within architecture, in this case like the repetition of the lights here. Again, kind of a circular shape, obviously with the lights, a triangular shape that's leading us down through the photograph or up through the photograph, depending on what way you look at it. And then space. Think about leaving a bit of room for your subjects as well. You don't have to fill the entire frame all the time when it comes to landscape photography. Here we've got a good example using the rule of thirds here again of this lighthouse. There's lots of space over here on the right hand side, but the photograph still feels balanced. It doesn't feel empty. That space gives room to the photograph. And again here with this an example of the golden ratio actually in this particular case, because we've got a very low horizon, but it all kind of comes together with that sailboat here. Lots of room, lots of space, and it works very well for this photograph because it gives that impression of vastness. It gives that room of space. It gives an impression of scale when you're sailing on the ocean. So those are a few other compositional techniques to throw in now when it comes to your landscape photography, including the ones we had a look at back in lesson number 3. Now, so a lot to cover in that lesson, but don't forget we had our Did You Know earlier on, and I asked you, what city is this? Is it Dublin? Is it Paris? Is it Boston? And or is it London? You can see it's already highlighted here. It's Boston. So Boston is where this photograph was taken, number 3, and it's the oldest aerial photograph known to be in existence. Now, it's likely not the first aerial photograph. That was more than likely taken in Paris by Nadir, who was a very famous studio photographer. But as you can see here, I've uncropped it there, balloon view of Boston, taken October in 1860. October 13th in 1860. That's incredible photograph. So if you said number 3, Boston, you are 100% correct, and well done on getting that one right. So that's the end of this lesson. Let's have a quick look at what's coming up in lesson number 6 again, which, as I mentioned, is going to be all about portrait photography. We're going to have a look at getting better exposures for portrait by using our different metering modes. We'll have a look at how to achieve bokeh in the background using our depth of field. We'll have a look at how to reveal someone's character and compositions with portrait photography, and so much more in this lesson as well. So do join me for that lesson.
Please subscribe, like and share.